The jungle on Tess had no interest in the war. It grew regardless, indifferent and immense, swallowing the dead from both sides with equal patience. The humidity was a physical thing, a pressure against the skin, a weight in the lungs, and by the third hour of the assault Orin had stopped noticing it the way a drowning man stops noticing water. He moved through the undergrowth in a low crouch, plasma carbine held tight against his chest, his squad fanned behind him in the practiced silence of soldiers who had trained together long enough that language was almost unnecessary. Hand signals. Breath patterns. The particular quality of stillness that meant hold. The Rath-Sekai encampment was 400 meters ahead. Thermal imaging from the drone past 2 hours ago had shown 37 heat signatures, but thermal imaging on Tess was unreliable. The jungle itself ran hot, volcanic substrate bleeding warmth up through the root systems, and the Rath-Sekai had learned decades ago to exploit that interference. There could be 50. There could be 20. You went in with what you had and you adjusted to what was true. What was true, at that moment, was that Orin's squad was 8 soldiers and 1 half-blood who counted as a 9th only on paper, and they were walking into the jungle headquarters of the 7th Rath-Sekai Expeditionary Command because Command had decided this was an acceptable risk. Command made those calculations from orbital platforms. Command had not been in the jungle in a very long time. Orin raised his fist. The squad stopped. He had heard something. Not a sound exactly, more an absence of sound, the jungle's ambient noise dropping in a radius slightly ahead and to his left, the way it dropped when something large and deliberate was moving through it. The Rath-Sekai were larger than humans on average, broader through the chest, and they moved differently, a rolling gait that distributed weight in a pattern human ears had learned to identify over a century of being hunted by it. Orin had grown up hearing that pattern in his sleep. His mother had been Rath-Sekai. He knew how his own blood moved through undergrowth. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of his throat and held up 3 fingers to Sergeant Calloway behind him. 3 hostiles. Bearing left. Calloway nodded once, turned, passed it back. The squad split without sound, 2 elements curving wide to either side while Orin went straight, carbine rising, breathing slowing to something controlled and deliberate. The first Rath-Sekai sentry stepped into a shaft of grey-green light and Orin shot him before the step was complete. The second turned toward the sound and Orin shot him too, moving already, not pausing to confirm because confirmation was for people who had time and Orin did not have time. He had momentum and he intended to keep it. The third sentry fired back, Rath-Sekai plasma bolts, slightly blorr than human side, a signature difference that Orin's eyes had catalogued so deeply it was reflex, and Orin dropped flat, rolled, came up behind a root structure the diameter of a transport vehicle, felt the heat. Bloom passed his shoulder close enough to raise the hairs on his arm. Then Calloway's element took the third sentry from the flank and the clearing went quiet again. Orin was already moving. The encampment was crude by Rath-Sekai standards, prefabricated shelter modules printed from local biomass, which meant they looked organic, looked like the jungle had grown them, which was the point. Command's intelligence had identified them from isotopic irregularities in the canopy moisture distribution. 6 months of satellite data to find what amounted to a cluster of huts. The war had long since become a war of patience as much as anything else, and patience was a resource both sides had in terrible abundance. They went in hard. There was no other way. The moment the sentries fell, every soldier in the encampment knew they were there, and the advantage of surprise collapsed into the simpler and more brutal arithmetic of fire and movement. Orin's squad punched through the eastern perimeter while the B element, which had looped around through an extra 30 minutes of jungle, hit from the south, and for approximately 4 minutes the encampment was a chaos of plasma fire and impact grenades and the particular screaming that happened when bodies were catastrophically damaged, screaming that Orin heard but did not process, that traveled through him the way background noise travels through a busy room without landing on anything. He was looking for the command module. Thermal, comm signatures, the slightly higher construction quality that indicated where decisions were made. He found it in the center of the encampment, partially collapsed by an impact grenade that had landed too close, and he went through the doorway low and fast and found 3 Rath-Sekai inside, 2 of them soldiers and 1 of them not. The 2 soldiers died quickly. Orin was very good at this. He had been doing it since he was 17, which meant he had been doing it for 9 years, which meant that roughly a third of his entire life had been the specific practiced execution of making other living things stop living. He did not think about this during the act. He thought about angles and cover and the fact that the third figure in the room, the one who was not a soldier, who wore no combat armor, who was old, had not moved. The old Rath-Sekai stood very still beside a field table covered in mapping displays. He was tall, which all Rath-Sekai were, but age had curved his spine slightly, brought his head forward on his neck in the particular stoop of someone who had spent decades bent over paperwork and tactical displays. His skin was the deep copper brown that Rath-Sekai called bronzeborn, darker than Orin's own mixed coloring, marked across the left side of his face with the ritual scarring that indicated rank. General-level scarring. Orin recognized the pattern because his mother had shown him, years ago, from photographs, the way you might show a child historical artifacts. He pointed his carbine at the old male's chest. The general looked at him with eyes that were very calm and very tired and did not look like the eyes of someone who expected to survive this. "I am General Varathkale Soren," the old male said, in Rath-Sekai. His voice was low, unhurried. "Commander of the 7th Expeditionary. I will not resist." Orin understood him perfectly. He kept his carbine up. "On your knees," he said, in Rath-Sekai. The general's eyes shifted. A small recalibration, something that might have been surprise. Then he went to his knees, slowly, one hand braced on the field table because his joints did not cooperate the way they once had, and Orin crossed the room and secured his wrists with a binding wrap and thought, with a part of his mind that never entirely stopped cataloguing and assessing, that this was either the best intelligence capture in the last 2 decades or a trap so elaborate he couldn't see the shape of it yet. He commed Callaway. "Command module secure. 1 HVT, confirmed general-level insignia. Perimeter." Callaway's voice came back rough and slightly ragged with effort. 7 hostiles down, 2 runners, 1 of ours injured. "We're clear. Hold perimeter. I'm coming out." He looked at General Soren, who was kneeling in the wreckage of his command post with the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting to see where it led. "Can you walk?" Orin asked. "I can walk," the general said. "I have been walking for 60 years. I expect I can manage a little further." Orin thought that was an odd thing to say. He filed it and moved the general out into what remained of the encampment, into the grey-green heat of Tess's morning, and did not yet understand that those 3 days had already begun. Command's orders came through while they were still extracting, while Callaway was applying a wound seal to Yuri Okafor's shoulder and the jungle was beginning, already, to take back the ground they had burned. The orders came in text, which was unusual. Voice orders could be misheard. Text orders could be cited. Transport HVT Soren, VK, General Equivalent Rank, to Facility Mirren 7 for secure interrogation. All available assets committed to ongoing TESS engagement. Transport to be conducted single pilot, single craft, security assessment, manageable. ETA, 72 hours. Orin, T. Assigned. Authorization code follows. Orin read it twice. Then he commed the duty officer. "This is Orin. I have confirmed receipt of transport orders. I need clarification on security complement." A pause. Then, "There is no security complement. Asset is restrained and non-combatant. You are the security complement. The asset is a Rath-Sekai general. We're aware of what the asset is, soldier. Do you have a problem with the orders?" Orin looked at General Soren, who was sitting on the ground against a root structure, wrists bound, watching the jungle with an expression that was not quite peaceful but was something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who had stopped anticipating and started simply observing. "No," Orin said. "No problem." The craft was a long-haul scout runner, designed for single pilot with minimal passenger accommodations, a fold-down bunk, a basic galley unit, a locked security compartment that Orin had no intention of using because it had no oxygen regulation and he did not actually want the general to die before reaching the facility. He loaded the general aboard, secured his wrist binding to a structural point with 2 meters of slack, enough to move, to use the head, to lie down, and ran pre-flight while the sounds of the battle on Tess faded behind them and the atmosphere gave way to the cold black of space. The general did not speak during departure. He sat in the secondary seat. Orin had not intended to give him a seat, had assumed he would sit on the floor, but the general had looked at the seat and then at Orin with quiet patience, and Orin had made the calculation that a general who was comfortable was less likely to be a problem than one who was being deliberately degraded, and he looked out the viewport as Tess shrank beneath them, at the green and grey swirl of it. The cloud systems, the thin line of orbital debris from 17 years of space engagement that ringed the planet like a filthy halo. "I have looked up at this planet," the general said, "from the surface. For 11 years. Orin said nothing. He ran his navigation calculations and set his course. 11 years I have been on Tess," the general continued, still looking at the viewport. "I arrived when it was still being contested. Before the colony burns. Before the Shallow Sea campaign." A pause. "I am 68 years old. I have fought in this war for 60 years. I was 8 when my cohort fathers took me to my first assignment. They told me the war would be over by the time I was grown. Orin locked in his course and pushed back from the navigation console and looked at his prisoner. You don't need to talk, he said. I know, the general said. I am talking because I want to. He turned from the viewport. His eyes were amber, which was not Rath-Sekai standard coloring. Most ran to gold or dark brown, and there were decades in them, layered and dense. You are half-blood. Orin kept his face level. That's in my file. I did not read your file. I can see it. Your bone structure. Your coloring. The way you move. The general tilted his head very slightly. Your mother was Rath-Sekai. My mother is dead. I am sorry, the general said, and he said it the way people said it when they actually meant it, without the reflexive lightness that made condolences easier to deliver. He said it and then he was quiet for a moment, letting it sit, which was the Rath-Sekai way of honoring grief, not moving past it too quickly, not papering it over with more words. Orin turned back to his console. We have 71 hours. I'd recommend sleep. The bunk folds out. I'll show you the operation. You speak Rath-Sekai, the general said. Enough. More than enough. Your accent is, a slight pause, inland Verith province. Second or third generation. My mother was from Verith province, Orin said, before he decided whether he wanted to say it. The general nodded slowly. I am from the coast. Kaleshore. We used to say that inland Rath-Sekai had no poetry in them, only stubbornness. A pause. We were usually wrong. Orin showed him the bunk mechanism and the galley and the waste facilities and told him that any attempt to access the navigation console, comms array, or weapons locker would trigger a restraint failsafe that would pull his wrist binding to the wall with enough force to break his arm. The general listened to this information with the attentiveness of someone who did not intend to test it. Then he lay down on the bunk with the careful deliberateness of old joints and old muscles, and he closed his eyes, and within what seemed like a very few minutes he was asleep. Orin sat in the pilot's seat and watched the stars and thought about 71 hours. The general woke after 6 hours and asked, with some formality, if there was any tea. Orin, who had not slept, who had spent 6 hours running system checks that did not need running and reviewing tactical reports from tests that told him nothing he could act on, found a packet of heat brew in the galley stores, the human-side standard issue kind, which would not taste the way Rath-Sekai tea tasted, and made 2 cups because he was going to need something eventually and it might as well be now. He handed a cup to the general, who accepted it with both hands, the Rath-Sekai gesture of thanks, and drank it without complaint. Tell me your name, the general said. You'll get that information when we arrive at. I know I will get it at the facility. I am not asking for the file. I am asking you. He held the cup in both hands and looked at Orin steadily. We are going to be on this ship for 3 days. I would like to know your name. Orin. Orin. That is a human name. It is. And your Rath-Sekai name? Your mother would have given you one. Orin had not heard that name spoken aloud in 4 years. He had not spoken it himself in longer. He kept it somewhere that was not exactly secret but was not available either, the way you kept things that were too important to be handled casually. She did, he said. I don't use it. The general nodded and did not push. He drank his tea. Outside, the stars were the particular cold and infinite scatter of deep transit space, nothing marking any direction as special, nothing to indicate that 3 days in this direction was a facility where a general would be dismantled for information and that 3 days in the opposite direction was a planet still on fire. May I ask you something? The general said. You can ask. When you came through the door of my command module, you had already killed 2 of my soldiers. You pointed your weapon at me. What were you thinking? Orin looked at him. I was thinking you might have a secondary weapon. That is what you were thinking tactically. I am asking what you were thinking. That's what I was thinking. The general considered this. I was thinking, he said slowly, that you were very young. That you moved like someone who had been trained to move that way before he was old enough to have moved any other way. And I thought, he stopped. Resumed. I thought that this was what we had made. On both sides. That the most fluent thing either of our civilizations has produced in 112 years is a particular kind of very young person who is extraordinarily good at killing. The ship's ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the drive system something cycled with a low periodic vibration that Orin had already catalogued and determined was not a fault. You're not going to manipulate me, Orin said. I want you to know I understand what this is. The general looked at him with something that might have been mild surprise. What is it? You're talking to establish rapport. To make yourself human to me. To make it harder for me to be the person who delivers you to interrogation. Is it working? No. The general was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not doing that. I'm 68 years old and I have spent 60 years talking only to soldiers and only about the war, and I am very tired and I find that I want to talk to someone who is not talking about the war. Even for a little while. He looked at his cup. I understand if you don't believe me. I would not believe me either. But it is the truth. Orin said nothing. He refilled his own cup because it was something to do with his hands. Your mother, the general said. How did she come to be on the human side? She was captured when she was young. Decided to stay. Orin sat back down. She met my father. Ah, the general said, with the weight of someone filing something significant. So you were born into this. You did not choose a side. Nobody chooses a side. You're born to one. True. But most people are born to one side and stay. You were born to two. That is different. The amber eyes were thoughtful. What do your fellow soldiers make of you? Orin had expected something other than that question. He found himself recalibrating. They make of me what they need to, he said. Good ones see a soldier. Bad ones see something else. And what do the Rath-Sekai soldiers see when they see you? Traitor, Orin said. Or they see a Rath-Sekai face and hesitate for half a second, and then I've already shot them. The general absorbed this with the stillness he seemed to carry everywhere, the stillness of someone who had decided a long time ago not to spend energy on reactions. You have used your heritage as a weapon. I have used everything available to me as a weapon. That's what surviving is. Yes, the general said quietly. That is what surviving is. He looked out the viewport again. The stars made no expression back. I have a son. He is 40 years old. He has been fighting for 22 years. I have seen him perhaps 11 times in those 22 years. We do not, he paused. We do not have very much to say to each other that is not about the war. And I do not want to talk about the war. Orin thought about his father, who was 61 and stationed on a garrison post at Relay Station 14, and who sent messages that were careful and brief and always ended with be careful, as though that were a thing a soldier could simply choose to be. My father sends messages, Orin said. I don't always answer them. Why not? The question was simple. Direct. Not unkind. Because I don't know what to say that isn't about the war, Orin said. And he doesn't want to hear about the war. The general looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the weight of someone recognizing something in a mirror. Yes, he said. Exactly yes. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different quality of silence than it had been before. It was not the silence of two enemies and a long corridor of time to fill. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was the silence of two people who had said something true. The second day brought a conversation that Orin had not prepared for. He was running a routine diagnostic on the navigation array. Genuinely routine, this time, not the compulsive rechecking of the night before, when the general looked up from what appeared to be a state of meditation and said, Do you know why the war started? Orin did not look up from his console. Resource dispute. The Kerev colonies. That is what you were taught. That's what happened. That is the last intelligible reason, the general said. Not the first. He shifted on the bunk, adjusting his position with the incremental care of someone managing old pain. The Kerev colonies were the flashpoint. I agree. But the war that followed, the 112 years, that is not about Kerev. It has not been about Kerev since approximately the 4th year. Everything since then has been, he searched for the word, accumulated injury. Accumulated insult. Every death that needs to be answered by another death. The mathematics of it. You're saying it's pointless. I am saying it has no remaining object except its own continuation. The general's voice was without inflection, which was more unsettling than anger. There are people on both sides for whom peace would be a catastrophe. I do not mean that cynically. I mean that there are economies built around this war. Command structures whose authority depends on the war. Entire professional and social classes whose identity is the war. If it ended, they would not know who they were. A pause. I suspect you understand this better than most. What I do ends with the war, Orin said. Yes. And does that trouble you? He had never been asked that directly. He had thought it, late at night, in the particular hour when the brain produces its most honest and least welcome assessments. But no one had asked him. "I don't know who I am outside of this," he said. It came out without ceremony, without the protective coating he would normally have applied. He heard it land in the air of the cabin and could not take it back. The general did not respond immediately. He gave it space. That Rath-Sekai stillness, letting truth sit without rushing to cover it. "I did not know who I was outside of this either," he said, finally. "And I am 68 years old. You are 26. 27. 26. You have time that I do not. That is not nothing. You're telling me to stop fighting. I am telling you nothing. I am noting that you are 26 years old and have never known a single day without this war, and I think that is—" The general stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I think that is a terrible thing. I think we did a terrible thing. Both sides. I think we handed this to you, all of you, an entire generation, 2 generations, 3, and we said, this is what the world is, and you believed us because you had nothing else to compare it to." Orin's console chimed. He looked at it automatically, his body moving through the familiar reflex, and what he saw on the screen made him go very still. A contact. Small craft, running without transponder, on an intercept vector. 40 minutes out. He did not look at the general. He ran the analysis quickly and cleanly, pulling every sensor reading, cross-referencing drive signatures. Rath-Sekai configuration. Military-grade stealth package. Moving fast, too fast for a courier, too fast for standard transit. Moving with the specific speed and bearing of a craft that knew where it was going and was not interested in arriving quietly. "General," he said. The general looked at the tone of his voice more than the word. He straightened. "Someone is coming to meet us," Orin said. "Rath-Sekai configuration. No transponder. They've been tracking us since we left Tess." He turned to look at the general directly. "Who knows you were captured?" The general's face had gone very still. The kind of still that is not calm but is the thing that has to precede a decision. "Anyone with access to your command's communications. Anyone with access to my command's intelligence apparatus." A pause. "I see. Who would want you dead before you reach interrogation?" The general looked at him for a moment. "The same people I was going to tell your command about." "Your own side." "The war does not have sides in the way you imagine it," the general said. "It has people who need it to continue. They exist in both of our commands. And I know their names." Orin turned back to the console. 37 minutes. Single craft, which meant a small team, 3, maybe 4, given the craft's size. Assassination units ran light. They did not need many people to kill one old general and one half-blood soldier on an unarmed scout runner. The scout runner was unarmed in the conventional sense. It had no forward cannons, no torpedo capacity. It had a point defense system designed to deflect debris, which could be reconfigured, and it had Orin. He pulled up the defense configuration and began to work. "What are you doing?" the general asked. "My job." He paused. "Get off the bunk. Get on the floor, as far aft as you can. Put your back against the drive housing. It'll give you some protection from forward impacts." The general moved without argument, which Orin noted. Old soldiers recognized the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The contact resolved on visual at 14 minutes, a narrow scout killer, black-holed, no running lights, moving at the kind of speed that said it had committed completely to this intercept and had no intention of breaking off. Orin watched it come and thought about angles and distances and the specific capabilities of a point defense system that had been designed by someone who had definitely not anticipated this exact situation. He had 11 minutes before the contact entered optimal engagement range. He used 8 of them to reconfigure the point defense emitters into something that would work offensively at very close range, which meant he needed to get very close, which meant he needed to do something the scout killer was not expecting. Scout killers expected evasion. They were built for pursuit. Orin cut his thrust to 0. Complete stop. The scout killer's approach velocity was fixed. It had calculated an intercept based on Orin's prior vector. When Orin stopped, the geometry changed, and the scout killer had approximately 4 seconds to recalculate and adjust before it had overshot. Those 4 seconds were what Orin needed. The scout killer crossed to his forward quadrant and Orin fired all 4 reconfigured emitters simultaneously in a tightly focused beam that the original designers would have found alarming and that the scout killer's hull, which was armored against debris, was not armored against. The beam lasted 1.3 seconds. The scout killer lasted too. The explosion was brief and silent in the way that space explosions were always brief and silent, a sudden brightness that peaked and began to disperse immediately into the cold dark, debris expanding outward in a perfect sphere that would keep expanding for years and eventually become part of the background scatter of a solar system that had been accumulating human and half-Rath-Sekai wreckage for a century. Orin held his vector for 30 seconds, watching the debris field, watching for secondary signatures, confirming on every sensor that there was nothing else coming from any direction. There was nothing. One craft. 4 crew, he estimated. They were gone. He became aware that his hands were very steady on the console, which was normal. His hands were always steady during, it was after that they sometimes had opinions, and that the cabin behind him was completely silent. He turned around. The general was on the floor, back against the drive housing as instructed, wrists still bound, watching Orin with an expression that was not quite readable. It was something between assessment and something older, something that had to do with having spent 60 years building a model of the world and then watching that model be insufficient. "Are there more?" the general asked. "I don't think so. I'll keep monitoring." "How did you do that?" "This ship has no weapons. It has components that can be weapons." Orin turned back to the console and ran another full sensor sweep. "Clean. It's what I do. I look at what I have and I find what can be made of it." The general was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why?" Orin ran the sensor sweep again. "Why what? Why did you fight them?" The general's voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone asking a question they actually want answered and not the easy answer. "You could have let them come. I am your prisoner. My death would resolve your mission without requiring interrogation. A dead general is a simpler outcome than a captured general in many respects. Why did you fight them?" Orin thought about this. The honest answer was that he had begun fighting before thinking, which was what 9 years of training produced. But the general was not asking about instinct. He was asking about intention. He was asking what Orin would have done if he had stopped to ask himself what he wanted. "Because those were my orders," Orin said. "To deliver you to the facility alive." The general looked at him for a long time. A quiet, sustained, amber-eyed attention that had the texture of someone reading something they have read before in a different language and finding that it means something they did not expect. "No," the general said slowly. "That is not why." Orin did not respond. He did not deny it. He kept his eyes on the sensor array and said nothing, and the silence between them was the densest it had been, denser than the first hours of the journey, dense with things that had been said and things that had not been said and the space between those two territories where actual truth lived. The third day. They did not talk in the morning, which was a shipboard morning, the arbitrary designation of a point in a 72-hour journey where the light in the cabin was set slightly warmer and both of them had slept, the general on the bunk, Orin in the pilot's chair, which reclined to something that was not exactly horizontal but was sufficient. Orin woke first and made the heat brew again, and by the time the general's eyes opened Orin had already set a cup within reach of the 2-meter tether. Orin ate a ration pack. The general ate a ration pack. They were not designed for Rath-Sekai metabolism, but the general ate without complaint, which Orin thought said something about 60 years of field soldiering. In the afternoon, which was also arbitrary, ship time, the general said, "What will you do after this?" "After you deliver me." "Return to Tess." "And after Tess?" "There is no after Tess. There's whatever comes after Tess. Another posting. Another campaign." "Until when?" Orin considered the question with more seriousness than he would have 3 days ago. "Until it ends or I do. Those are not the only options. They're the ones I have." "You could leave," the general said. "Soldiers do. It is not unknown." "Where would I go?" Orin asked, and it was not a rhetorical question, not a deflection. It was the actual question. The one he had not allowed himself to hold directly because it had no answer that did not require a self he had not assembled yet. Where did you go when you were built entirely for a thing? When the structure of you, the reflexes and the silences and the way you read a room for threats and the way you woke at sounds and the way you ate and slept and moved, was all organized around one purpose. The general said, "Verith province is very beautiful in the dry season. I have not been there, but I have seen photographs. Inland river valleys. Limestone formations. Nothing that looks like anything anyone has ever fought over. That's Rath-Sekai territory. You are half Rath-Sekai. The half that matters, for border crossing, is the other half. The war is 68 years old less than you are." The general wrapped both hands around his cup. I do not believe it will outlast both of us. And if it ends, he stopped. There are river valleys. That is all I am saying. Orin looked out the viewport. Ahead, at a distance his instruments could now measure with precision, was the gravity signature of the system-containing facility Mirren 7. 6 hours. You were going to tell them things, Orin said. Before they tried to kill you. You said you knew names. People on both sides who want the war to continue. Yes. You're still going to tell them? The general was quiet for a moment. I am 68 years old, he said. I have fought for 60 years. I have watched 4 generations of soldiers die in a war that has had no real purpose for 108 of its 112 years. He set down his cup. I have grandsons. One is 6 years old. One is 4. If I say nothing, they will go to war. There is no question. They will be 8 years old and someone will take them to their first assignment and tell them the war will be over by the time they are grown. He paused. I will not do that. I will not be the man who said nothing when saying something might have changed it. Orin thought about the boy he had been at 8 years old. He had been living on Garrison Station Relay 4 with his father, and the war had been a sound in the background of everything, a frequency that the world hummed at, and he had not understood yet that the world was not supposed to hum that way. He had thought the war was weather. He had thought it was the nature of things. You know it might not work, he said. Whatever you tell them. Of course I know that. The general looked at him steadily. I also know that doing nothing is certain to fail. Doing something is merely likely to. They flew in silence for another hour. The stars did not change. The course did not change. The distance to Mirren 7 decreased with the indifferent patience of physics. Can I ask you something? Orin said. You can ask. At Tess. When I came through the door. You didn't try to run. You didn't fight. Your guards were dead and you had 2 seconds, maybe, before I had a clean shot. You could have, he thought about angles. There was a window aperture on the eastern wall. You could have gone through it. Yes, the general said. I probably could have. Why didn't you? The general was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Orin thought he had decided not to answer. Then, because I was tired. Because I have been tired for a very long time. And because I thought, he stopped, started again. I thought, this is a young person. A very young person. In a burning building that he did not build. And perhaps if I do not make him kill me today, something can be different. A pause. I did not know what different would look like. I still do not. But I thought, at minimum, I will not make this particular young person carry one more body. Orin sat with that. My mother, he said, eventually, used to say that the Rath-Sekai word for peace doesn't mean absence of war. It means something more like, the moment before you decide to throw the stone. The held moment. Varath-Sol, the general said, and his voice changed on the word, went softer the way voices went when they were touching something they had learned very young. Yes. That is the word. The moment where both futures are still possible. He looked at Orin. Your mother taught you well. She died when I was 12, Orin said. She taught me what she could. The general nodded. He did not offer words. He simply let it be what it was, which was a loss, which was still a loss after 14 years, which would probably always be a loss. She taught you the word for peace, the general said, finally. That is not nothing. No, Orin said. It's not nothing. Mirren 7 appeared on the forward display 4 hours later, a station installation, not a planet, grey and utilitarian in the way of all secure facilities, which were built to function and not to comfort. Orin ran the docking approach automatically, the motions of it fully habituated, while behind him the general used the waste facilities and sat back down and looked out the viewport at the station growing ahead of them with the expression of someone who knew what was coming and had made their peace with it. Orin ran the docking checklist. He did not look at the general. The docking arm caught them at 0900 station time and the airlock pressurized and the hatch cycled, and on the other side were 4 security personnel in the grey uniform of Facility Mirren 7, which was non-military, which was intelligence branch, which was the part of the command structure that Orin trusted the least and had the least ability to do anything about. They were professional and efficient. They unclipped the general's wrist binding from the structural point and fitted him with a more comprehensive restraint, and they did it without roughness but also without the particular quality of attention that acknowledged that the general was a person rather than a package. Orin stood in the airlock and watched. This is General Varath-Sekai Soren, he said, to the facility officer in charge, A compact woman with close-cropped grey hair and the eyes of someone who had worked in places like this for a long time. Confirmed general equivalent rank, 7th Rath-Sekai Expeditionary. Transport from Tess without incident. The officer looked at her manifest. 72 hours. Any contact beyond minimum necessary. He's healthy. No attempts to access ship systems or communication. He'll need his joints checked. He's 68 and the bunk wasn't ideal. The officer made a note. She did not ask why Orin knew the general was 68. She did not ask anything else. She nodded to her team and the general was walked forward, into the facility, into the grey corridor beyond the airlock, and Orin watched him go. He turned to leave. Orin. He stopped. The sound of his name, just the human-side name, the only one he had given, in that voice, in that particular low register, from a point down the grey corridor where the general had stopped and was looking back at him. The facility officer made a small sound of objection. The general ignored her with the practiced authority of someone who had been ignoring institutional objections for 60 years. Orin turned. The general looked at him from 20 feet away. The amber eyes were steady. The restraints were on his wrists. The grey walls were around him. He was going into a facility from which he might not emerge for years, if he emerged at all, and he knew it, and he was looking at Orin the way people looked at things they were going to need to remember. Varathsol, the general said. You are already in it. 1 sentence. Exactly 1. The facility officer moved the general forward and the grey corridor took him and the door cycled shut. Orin stood in the airlock for a moment. Then he walked out, through the docking arm, back toward the scout runner, and he got as far as the corridor junction outside the docking bay before he stopped. He put his back against the wall. The wall was cold and smooth, the particular anonymous grey of military installations everywhere, the grey of a world built entirely around the continuation of something that had forgotten why it started. He stayed there. He was 26 years old. He had been born in this war and raised in this war and trained in this war, and he had never, in 26 years, stopped to ask whether there was a moment, the held breath, Varathsol, where both futures were still possible. He could feel it. That was the thing. He could feel exactly where it was. He stayed against the wall because whatever came next was going to require walking, and walking was going to require knowing what direction to walk in, and knowing that was going to take him just one more moment. Just one. The held moment. Before the stone was thrown or put down. He stayed there, in the grey corridor, alone, with his back against the wall and his eyes on the middle distance, in the last quiet instant before he had to decide what kind of man to be.